Good evening. I'd like to welcome you all to Now New Jersey's 2020 Virtual State Conference. Now New Jersey is celebrating its 45th year in the state with grassroots activists organizing to push for rights and advocate for women. It is my proud accomplishment that we are able to bring this webinar series this year. We are doing a series of programming leading up to our October 3rd conference. And we have really taken some care and intentionally chosen our webinars around NOW's 6 core issues. And the one that we have for you today is basically under our issue area of ending violence against women. And with all the recent changes that have taken place with regards to Title IX and its implications for sexual assault victims on campuses, we thought this was a perfect time to bring that to you. So before we start, I do want to thank our sponsors. We have several levels of sponsorships, and our sustainable sponsor this year is Senator Nicholas Scutari. The Equal Rights Emerald sponsorship, we have the Hudson County Democratic Organization under Chairwoman Amy DeGuise, and the New Jersey Policy Perspective. And then we have some pro-choice platinum sponsors, the Essex County Democratic Committee, Assembly Member Thomas Giblin, Millennials for New Jersey, Senator Troy Singleton, and Loretta Weinberg. And we thank them all, especially our legislators, because not only are they sponsoring this conference, we know that they support us and champion all our values. So as we get started, I am going to introduce myself a little bit, and then I will move on to our panelists that I'm so happy to see with us today. My name is Anjali Mirotra. I am the president of Now New Jersey. I have been in this role since January of 2019. And I have to tell you, it has been my distinct pleasure. Every day, I am amazed at the advocates and the advocacy organizations that I get to work with in New Jersey. Not to mention that we do actually have a legislature and a administration that is friendly to our causes. And that makes a huge difference in my work and the work satisfaction that I get every day. So I want to thank all the organizations, the administration, and the legislature that I get to work with. So that's just a little bit about me. I'm going to move on to our panelists and ask each one of them to introduce themselves briefly and also talk a little bit about what brought them to their work on this particular topic. So I'm going to start with Penny Venetis, who is a professor, clinical professor at Rutgers Law School in Newark. Penny?
It's such a pleasure to be speaking today. Thank you, Anjali, for inviting me, and I'm really delighted to be on this panel on a very, very important topic, which is the changes that have occurred, which is really essentially the gutting of Title IX, a statute that was enacted to actually protect women from, among other things, violence at schools. I have been teaching at Rutgers for a very long time, nearly 30 years, and I deal with issues related to human rights and civil rights with a particular focus on gender-related issues. And I've worked in this space, the Title IX related space, for quite some time. I have represented victims. I have worked with schools to change their policies so that they can be more focused on victims' needs. And I also have worked closely with the Rutgers administration to make sure that we have the best Title IX policies that are in compliance with federal law, state law, and also our values, which is to make sure that all of our students receive the best possible education in the safest possible environment.
Thank you, Penny. Jerin? So Jerin Arifa, just a brief introduction, is a fellow Now member. She started the first virtual chapter of Now, but she has also been an activist, and I will let her tell you a little bit more about what has brought her to this topic. Jerin?
Thank you, Anjali. I want to echo what Penny said. It's an honor to be here with all of you. And thank you for organizing this very important event. My name is Jerin Arifa, and I am also now a sister. And I did start the first virtual chapter of Now. We have members from Arizona to New York, and we worked on both online and offline campaigns, really leveraging the digital space to create grassroots change. And what brings me here is I spearheaded the sexual assault, harassment, domestic violence, and anti-stalking policy, basically the Title IX policy for City University of New York, which is the third largest university in the United States. So the policy has affected 500,000 students annually. And I created the policy while I was undocumented. So navigating a lot of different spaces. And yeah, I'm very, very concerned about the changes, but I also think we can still protect students.
Thank you, Jerin. Our last panelist is Emily Ralph, and I'm so glad to have her here too. Emily is a former Title IX administrator, and I will let you tell her, and I've read her bio, so I know it's very impressive. But I'll let Emily tell you more about that.
Sure. Well, I have a joint degree in law and social work, an MSW and a JD. So early on, I did child abuse investigations and that sort of thing and child welfare work. But I eventually became a Title IX administrator. So really implementing some of the Obama era guidance, both at Morgan State, which is an HBCU in Baltimore, and Drew University in New Jersey. So I was involved in some grants and lots of work trying to create comprehensive prevention programs at the university, but also a response to sexual violence that was improved from previous college practices. So I can hopefully help give some insight on sort of the implementation of some of that early guidance and the difference that has with the current Devos changes. So, well, thanks again, and also an honor to participate with all of you. So,
thank you, Emily. So for those of our audience who are wondering, exactly what we're talking about, I know that I have been interested in this topic for several reasons. I have two daughters who recently graduated from college, and actually while they were in college, they were both RAs, so they were not just students. They saw a little bit from the administrative point of view as well. And then last year, Penny invited me when they had a seminar on this topic at Rutgers Law School, and it was a full day, and it was really eye-opening. And it really made me think about a lot of things differently, and I don't think many people understand how Title IX is now being used on campuses for this. So I'm going to ask Penny to give us a little bit of a background on Title IX and how it's now being used. Sorry, you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, I was delighted that you were able to come to the symposium last year, and I'm glad that you're doing this follow-up. It's great. So I want to give a little bit of history to Title IX, because people don't quite know what it is, even though they hear it a lot. So Title IX is a statute that was enacted in 1972, and it was enacted because the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not include anti-discrimination mandates in the educational setting. There were mandates for the workplace. There were mandates and in 1965 in voting rights, but nothing covered the educational setting. And because of the activism of women in the university area, Congress enacted a Title IX, and it's a very plain, 3-line statute that says that any institution of education, whether it's from preschool all the way up to graduate school, that receives any federal funding cannot discriminate on the basis of sex, meaning that there has to be equal opportunity for women. So initially, Title IX was interpreted to mean, schools have to provide equal opportunities for sports, which were sorely lacking. So it's good that that happened. But subsequently, because the language of the statute is so broad, the Supreme Court in the 1970s and 1980s says, no, the statute is much more far-reaching than just requiring schools to offer equal opportunity in sports. It actually requires schools to make sure that the educational setting is a safe space and that there aren't and that female students are safe from violence, from sexual harassment, from sexual abuse, because if those harms are allowed to persist, they really are not able to participate fully in both the academic area and in the extracurricular areas. So, so that really, sort of gave the opportunity for students to feel like Title IX offered them protection. And it really wasn't until the Obama administration, however, where there was a concerted effort to actually make sure that schools were complying with the Title IX mandates of safety and security. So the Obama administration put out a series of guidances, basically telling schools what they needed to do to make sure that students were not victims. So preventative measures, and also things that the schools needed to be done afterwards to make sure that people who were victims of these horrible crimes actually were able to get the counseling they needed, that they were separated from the person who had attacked them or was harassing them. And it was quite comprehensive. And I have to say that schools, and the other panelists can talk about this because they were in the implementation phase, but the threat of having funding taken away is a pretty serious stick. And schools slowly but surely began to comply around the country. Again, not perfect, right? Nothing was ever perfect, and there was always room for improvement, but at least the federal government was saying, you must comply, you must make this space safe for women students and also LGBTQ students, because that was part of the Obama guidance to say that Title IX applied to all students. Unfortunately, there were changes that were made to Title IX very recently. Secretary of Education Devos, really spurred by men's rights groups and some academics, really completely gutted all of the precautions and the safety measures that were put in place by President Obama. And that's what we're dealing with now, and that's what we'll continue to talk about during this session.
Oops.
Yeah, we're definitely going to get to, what has happened in the last year and why we are concerned. But before we get to that, for those of our viewers who may have seen the movie The Hunting Ground, I know that made a huge impression on me. And even before that, we always heard about sort of the cases that, made it into the news, the big ones, like, whether it was the Duke lacrosse players, the University of Florida case comes to mind. And then even most recently, when my own daughters were applying for college, it was in Virginia, right? The University of Virginia and the Rolling Stone article. And given all of that sort of misinformation that's out there, and I know that, my daughters applied for college, I think it was like 2014. And that was kind of right in the middle, in the thick of this. And universities at that time, I remember there were these lists that the Obama administration was putting out, based on numbers and statistics on how universities were not dealing well with the whole sort of crisis. So I'm interested to hear exactly what the Obama guidelines were and how they were expected to sort of, I guess, fix that situation? Emily?
Sure. So, when the Obama, Biden guidance came out, there was a task force, there was a comprehensive set of, social scientists and some student groups who were interested in, sort of having some teeth to some Clinton era and, Bush era guidance from the OCR, or the Department of Education arm of the Civil Rights Department, which was responsible for telling colleges what they had to do to comply with Title IX when it came to responding to sexual violence. And some schools were really ahead of the curve with their own policies, but many were not. And so what, sexual violence is like, and really sexual misconduct, I guess, was an umbrella under the Obama guidance that included stalking and, of course, sexual assault, but also sexual harassment. So it could be verbal language. And it also included, intimate partner violence or domestic violence. So all of those types of allegations could be responded to by colleges. And I think that the previous speaker said it well when she said that basically the goal of any Title IX office is to remove the barriers that students had, that sexual discrimination, sex discrimination had to students learning on campus. So if a student, had a problem where, for example, they're being stalked on campus and really that is creating a barrier to their learning, or even a professor that was having an issue, let's say with a student or vice versa, all of those things could be responded to by the college. And there was a clear set of well thought out violent guidance from the Obama, Biden administration, which tried to balance, yes, the due process, which you hear about a lot in the new Devos era. So due process meaning that there was a fair, impartial person that was hearing both sides of any kind of allegation, but also the trauma, that the person reporting this had, and trying to make it so that that person had control over the process and was really driving the bus of the process, in other words. So making sure that that person could decide and determine how the process was going to continue for themselves. And so some of those, the guidance, there's a lot of nuance and detail, but I think the biggest change was really that colleges had to respond, that they were being held accountable, as you mentioned, like 500 schools at one point were being published as being under investigation for violations of this new guidance. And really that put sort of a fire under colleges to respond and to keep their students safe to the best of their ability. And lots of student groups were in cottage industry trainings were being created across the country at the same time. So really the Title IX coordinator role also, which I had, it didn't really exist before, not in the way that it does now. It's carefully defined as this person, the central person who's going to collect the data and systematically respond to sex discrimination complaints at the university. And so that was really the big thing, is that they were defining what kinds of behaviors were going to be considered sex discrimination and barriers to learning, and then defining how colleges had to respond to that to be compliant. And the goal really was to respond in a trauma-informed way that was using what we know from social science to help deter the chilling of reports and encourage reporting, encourage collecting of data, and encourage lots of prevention programs that you wouldn't have seen before Obama era guidance, like you do now, bystander intervention. Even you saw a lot of Take Back the Night events probably 10, 15 years ago, but just not the level of conversation that now is happening. So there really was, I think, a culture shift these past 8 years or so, 5 or 6 years, actually, not 8.
Yeah. So I think, but we also realized that even as, universities were trying to fulfill the requirements and satisfy them, I know that from hearing from my own daughters, from their experiences, The systems are not perfect, and things do fall through the cracks. And so I'm interested in hearing from Jerin, from a student perspective, how were these policies received? And, do you feel like they actually satisfied the need that was out there?
So as Penny mentioned, Title IX really should cover all types of gender-based violence. And the City University of New York, we were ahead of the game. We started working on the policy in 2008, and we passed it in 2010. So this was well before the Obama administration really started holding schools accountable. And I can't take credit for that. Anything that happens on a large scale or even small scale, it's a group of activists that come together. And so at Hunter College, it was me at Hunter College and another student at John Jay College who we were part of a training by Students Active for Ending Rape, SAFER. And we came together and realized we needed to create a CUNY-wide policy because we were being approached by students who had been victims, especially me because I ran the largest feminist organization in Hunter and maybe a student feminist organization and perhaps CUNY. And so a lot of people were approaching me and telling me about their being victims and what that was like for them. And so I didn't just want to respond after something had happened. I wanted to prevent it from happening. And so we went to administration to create this policy. And one of the reasons we're able to reach them is because I was on student government. And so another plug, women and gender non-conforming people need to run for office because really being on student government was huge. And so we approached administration and they put together a task force, and we were very adamant that there were people from every sector you can think of. So students, alumni, faculty, administration. We made sure there were LGBTQ people on the panel. And then we spent 2 years creating this policy because we really wanted it to be something that was meaningful and that all the stakeholders had some input. And so our policy actually incorporated a lot of things that Emily mentioned. And when I was a student, this shouldn't fall on students or activists. They should really be the administration. But I wanted to make it as easy as possible for the administration and everybody else to do the right thing. So I actually helped organize a lot of different events like bystander training through University of New Hampshire, bringing the bystander training and Men Can't Stop Rape and other organizations. And so we really created this chain reaction across CUNY where students were talking about it, students were coming together. And that's why we created a policy on paper that was really, really great. But like Penny and Emily said, at the end of the day, it always comes down to implementation. So as angry as I am about Devos and everything she's done, I'm still hopeful that as long as there are people who care on the ground, we can protect students.
Right. But did you feel like, just to follow up on that, did you feel like it worked?
At CUNY, obviously it wasn't perfect. And there were people who came forward who did not want to pursue actions for a variety of reasons. And nothing is ever perfect, especially when you bring in gender-based violence laws. But so yeah, there are definitely things that could have been improved. But I think the biggest thing that it did is it brought people together. And so it wasn't just one person. Like we, Penny, you spoke about government funding. So we actually reached out to elected officials. And so there's some real teeth because these were officials who were directly responsible for funding CUNY. So we had that support, but yeah, nothing's perfect. And because me and the people at Hunter were so active about the various trainings and everything we did, it was definitely better than other campuses.
Well, thank you, Jerin, and a shout out to Hunter because my sorority Phi Sigma Sigma was founded there. So, going back to this, one of the other things that strikes me is also, as Jerin said, I think the student voice is so important, and I've seen that, with other students, and even with my own daughter's school. I remember there being an incident where, students think that they're safe, right? And sometimes they don't take the precautions that they should. And I remember there being an incident where somebody was sleeping in their dorm room and had not locked their door. And somebody walked in and basically tried to assault them. And when the email was sent out to the students, they called it something like non-consensual sex or something like that. And the students were like, let's call it what it is. It's assault. So I think, that's really so important to getting anything done on, in a lot of ways, is to hold, the people in charge, wherever we are, in whatever institution, accountable, and having, making sure that they're doing the right thing. So we talked a lot about, the Obama guidelines. And then I know that the symposium that I went to last year, one of the reasons I think Penny had that was because there was concern that under the new education secretary, Betsy Devos, that a lot of those guidelines, which actually by that time, the majority of the universities in the country had already adopted in some form or the other, were now being rolled back, right? So I'm going to start with, I think, Penny, because she talked a little bit about how there was like academics involved that got the sort of thing started. And I love when she says men's rights groups, because I actually recently wrote something in an op-ed and I'm like, what is that even? But, I think it's really interesting how this administration in particular is sort of, choosing to give voice to groups that historically have not been marginalized, really, are just feeling threatened because sort of their power is being taken away.
Right.
So Penny, do you want to talk a little bit about what, Betsy Devos has been up to?
Well, unfortunately, she's been up to, a lot. Really, shortly after she took office, she really made it her mission to gut the Obama era guidance. There was a draft of the guidelines that were leaked, and there was an instant uproar, not only by women's rights groups like now, but by universities and by, almost everyone, because it really was a shifting of the focus from a person who was raped and protecting that person's rights, or someone who was the victim of sexual harassment or other form of sexual assault. And the focus automatically became on making sure that the person who was accused got, quote unquote, a fair hearing. Now, what the men's rights advocates and actually a handful of academics from Harvard Law School really started this whole movement to try and get criminal defendant-like due process protections for people who are accused of wrongdoing in the university setting, but only when we're talking about people who were accused of rape and sexual abuse and sexual assault. So no one was, throwing up their arms and saying that the hearings were unfair if somebody were brought before a disciplinary board for cheating or for stealing or for destroying property, university property. It really was, as, basically just looking under a microscope at gender-based violence and really saying, wait a second, if somebody is being accused of sexual abuse or sexual assault, then they need to have the same due process rights as they would in a criminal proceeding. And that's absurd. I mean, I'm a constitutional law person, a human rights person. And the reason that defendants in a criminal proceeding have very, very strong due process rights is because it says it in the Constitution. It says, it requires that the highest form of due process is given because there's a presumption of innocence. And there's a potential for their life or the liberty to be taken away, whether they're thrown in jail or actually sentenced to death. That's why we have these very, very strong protections like the right to counsel, the right to cross-examination, all of those things. And all of a sudden, folks were clamoring for people who were accused of a serious offense to the student code, who had violated someone's bodily integrity, who have committed a crime, to get the same type of protection in a school hearing, not a criminal hearing, in a school hearing that's determining whether the person should be suspended, whether the person should be expelled, or whether there should be no disciplinary action taken. And what is has been very, very frustrating, this sort of caught steam and and eventually reached the ears of President Trump and Secretary Devos. It really not only undoes the Obama era guidance. I mean, I wrote a law review article on this. It also undoes 40 years worth of jurisprudence that developed after Title IX was enacted, where the courts through the decades actually, said very, very clearly, a campus disciplinary proceeding is not the same as a criminal proceeding. You are not required to have the same sort of protections. You do not have a right to go to Rutgers or to Harvard or to wherever, right? You have, and also there's the public-private dichotomy. The Constitution and constitutional rights kick in when you're dealing with public institutions. Most institutions are not public. They're private institutions, and the case law is very clear from the Supreme Court on down that the due process protections that an accused student, whether accused of any infraction, has in a private institution are almost minimal. So we have, sort of the rules being rewritten for victims of gender-based violence who suffer serious, crimes and who don't report to begin with. And the, schools universally came out against these proposed regulations that passed anyway, and they've been in effect since June. This Department of Education gave only 2 months from middle of June to August 14th for every school in the nation that gets federal aid, again, from preschool all the way to graduate school, to comply with these regulations or risk losing funding, which is, really, really significant because they have to go back and revisit everything that they put together during the Obama years. And they also have to, sort of basically hold their nose while doing it because the schools objected to it. They liked having the, sort of the safety nets in place and the support in place that, although everyone has admitted were not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But there was a realization that if you are a victim of rape, or if you're being sexually harassed or sexually assaulted, you're not going to want to go to class. You are going to be afraid, especially if there aren't procedures in place to isolate the person who's harassing you and who's assaulted you from you. And those are now, those protections are now gone. And schools have been scrambling for the past 2 months and really are trying to do their best to stay true to all their students. Nobody wants a kangaroo court. Nobody wants to railroad someone who's before a disciplinary body. And frankly, that really was not happening. There were a couple of really sort of bad examples where people were falsely accused of rape, like the Duke and University of Virginia instances. And it really is a shame. It's really terrible. But that is, 2 cases compared to thousands and thousands of rapes that occur on campus. We have to put it all in perspective and make sure that the victims feel safe to come forward. And unfortunately, that's no longer the case.
Right, and it's and I think it's really interesting, when we talk about sort of the cases that there were like false accusations, how they get sensationalized, and all of a sudden, we talk about men's rights groups, but I will tell you, like as a suburban parent, I have been in conversations with other parents where, the parents of sons or boys are like, oh my God, I'm worried about my sons being accused. Like, you can't do anything anymore. Their whole life is going to be ruined. But the reality is, and we know this from statistics and facts, that I think it's 1 in 5 sexual assault cases that actually even get reported. You know, so the numbers are so low, and there's a very small percentage of those that may even possibly be false accusations.
Well,
So for the majority of these cases, we know that that's not, you know, the actual fact. But historically on campuses, you know, it has actually been the survivors, I don't like to call them victims, who have been shortchanged. But one of the things that struck me from the symposium was the fact that, you know, we always talk about reporting and how important that it is. But the big difference with Title IX and, you know, what takes place on a campus is the number one sort of motive or incentive for the campus is not so much the reporting, but it's to create that safe environment, right? So I know a lot of the Title IX sort of guidelines that were put in place had to do with things like counseling, you know, had to do with, you know, basically supportive services for the students. So Emily, does any of that change under the new DeVos things or no?
it's a really good question. I mean, there are, you know, interim measures that basically all the Obama era guidance that required universities to provide resources and academic resources and counseling and interim measures during the initial investigation, doing things like moving someone to a different dorm, moving folks out of classrooms if they're in the same class. I mean, those aren't as explicitly required as the previous guidance was. There's still supportive services that are really, you know, supposed to be part of this process, but it's not as, you know, explicit. I wanted to say though that the 1 out of 5, you know, the incidence of sexual assaults pretty consistently across campuses are about 1 out of 5 women will experience some kind of sexual, you know, non-consensual sexual activity on campus. But the number of incidents reported on most campuses are usually much lower than that. So the incidents that are reported in climate surveys, which are so important to get that actual data on incidents occurring, there's usually a discrepancy between the climate survey data and what universities are seeing in their offices. And one of the biggest changes in the Devos administration is that a formal complaint is only going to be needed to be responded to and or potentially gathered in data if the report comes to the Title IX coordinator. So, I mean, first of all, students usually don't know who the Title IX coordinator is. Previous guidance would say, hey, anyone that a student thought, you know, reasonably thought was an authority of some sort, they would then have to, you know, let the university know that there was an issue to get those supportive services. So, you know, decreasing that discrepancy, of course, makes campuses safer. Ironically, parents often look, okay, do we have high reports on our Clery numbers? You know, the Clery Act is still there, which requires universities to report some data and also put those on their website about sexual, you know, misconduct and sexual assault and rapes that are happening. And anyway, usually parents might look at that and see a high number and think this campus isn't safe. The odd part about this kind of work is that the higher the reports, the closer the number between the actual incidents occurring, which is pretty high, right? 1 out of 5 people are experiencing some kind of non-consensual activity, then the safer the campus arguably is, because if we know about what's happening with students, if they feel that they can come forward and they'll be treated, you know, their dignity will be intact, then we can take appropriate action. To either, you know, sometimes students in this situation might only want counseling, right? And under the Obama era administration, schools actually could work with that student to allow them to make those kinds of decisions. Right. And you know, so all of those things are also you know, things to consider in this realm, because we really want to see, is the new guidance going to decrease reporting from students? Is it going to chill reporting because they're going to be, you know, not as willing to go through such as Penny described as this really formal criminal-like process where, you know, when the liberty at stake, as she mentioned, is going to prison, you have all of these, you know, lots of processes and you know, cross-exam that's live and going back and forth, but that the liberty at, at stake in a college campus is simply, at least in New Jersey, where we do not have transcript notification like some states do, which means in some states they've passed legislation so that a transcript will have a notification if there's been a substantiated sexual assault for a student. In New Jersey, we didn't even have that. So let's say you're accused and expelled from a school. If you don't disclose that to another school, you could transfer to another school. And you're talking about a relatively small amount of liberty lost for that accused student that is being told they can't go to Rutgers, let's say, or they can't go to another school, Montclair State or wherever they are. So I do think that that's what's also not creating a balance that seems fair, both to schools, to students, to faculty, and to their families that are supporting them through school.
Right. And I know that in terms of, the university is still following the guidelines. I think we're trying to keep like most of the, I would say the Obama era guidelines, most of the universities are interested in keeping them. So I'm interested in hearing from Jerin, like, what do you think? And honestly, at this point, I'm just going to sort of open it up also the conversation. So feel free to just hop in, because we're actually now at a point where we're talking about what's going on with divorce, what is the national landscape, and really where do we go from here? And I know like Jerin has said that she's hopeful. So I'm really interested to hear what she thinks we can do next.
Yeah, I mean, like I said again, you can have the most perfect piece of legislation, but if it's not implemented, it means nothing. And like Penny said, Title IX is really constitutional. The way Title IX was looked at under Obama administration is really constitutional. It is based in constitutional law. So even though DeVos has gutted a lot of the requirements, I don't think the universities need to go backward. And like Emily was saying, looking at the rates of violence at a university on their website is really important. As far as me being hopeful, yes, I think it's always been the people on the ground that have, done the work. Like when you had the EEOC pass legislation that, or try to enforce legislation that women would not be discriminated against in a workforce environment, it was really the activists and the people on the ground to make sure that that was actually being followed. And so, yes, I'm very hopeful. People are much more aware of this issue, and there is a national movement that's been much stronger than it was before. So I think people really need to get together. And for example, when I worked on my policy, I brought in NOW and Feminist Majority Foundation and all these other groups and legislators to really come together and say to community, like, if you don't do this, your funding is going to get cut, or you're going to get really bad publicity, or a host of other things. And so I think as activists, we can still do that. Whether or not DeVos requires certain things does not prevent us from going to the press and talking about how a university is not doing the right thing.
Can I jump in a second? I mean, I think Jerin raises a good point of community activism, and I think that's certainly something that we need to do in New Jersey and elsewhere. And we, I think it's really critical, and I hope that this seminar is a jumping off point to try and enact good legislation in New Jersey. That obviously New Jersey has to also follow the federal law, right? If we don't, then we risk, the universities risk losing their funding. But we can put in place through working with grassroots organizations and legislators, we could put in place a series of protections that don't directly conflict with what's required by federal law, so that we don't have to worry about issues of preemption, federal preemption, but that offer the types of protection, the type of counseling that's no longer mandated, all of the protections that, are based in tried and true practices that universities have had in place now for almost a decade. And I think that's really, really critical. New York has a great statute, enough is enough, the best in the country. Yesterday when we were chatting before this, this talk, Emily talked about Maryland having, really good laws that are, older than, most people's awareness of Title IX. And it's really critical that we do that on the state level. I just want to emphasize, though, that we really can't ignore these, these regulations, and it makes it much easier for someone who's accused of sexual assault to sue the school. So the schools must follow these proceedings, but they also have state law that they have to follow, and they have to, and if we expand that state law to include a lot of protections, including, special training for school officials, a special police force like New York has, state police force to deal exclusively with issues of campus sexual assault. I think that that's a way that we can put back in, as a community, we could put back in the protections that have been slashed and cut. And if the Trump administration and the federal government doesn't care about the victims and the survivors, I like that word too, Anjali, then we should show that the state supports those survivors and that we can offer them protections through state law and state funding, as Jerin said.
And I think, the last 3 or 4 years, under the Trump administration, I think all of us have learned that, the systems and the institutions that we thought were safe, that we thought protected us, our Constitution, our, so many things that we, thought were unthinkable, right? Like, and then we find out, like, oh no, that's just, it's a suggestion. It's been tradition to do that. And I think we're all in a place now where we're realizing that regardless of what happens this November, in the election, moving forward, if we really want to protect ourselves in so many different arenas, we probably should pass statutes, right? I know, like in New Jersey, for example, we're talking about, and other states have done it, about codifying Roe v. Wade. We don't know what's going to happen at the federal level. So we want to make sure that we have some kind of protections in place at the state level. And I think that's what we're talking about. So I'm also curious, and this is just, for my own sort of ignorance, I think it comes out of. So my understanding has always been is that in education, when we talk about federal versus state rights, education has always sort of fallen under state. So in that case, if we do enact legislation, is it really challenged at the federal level, or do we have the right to sort of enact our own statutes with regard to this?
Well, we have the right to enact whatever we want, but if a school wants to get federal aid, and most schools do, we have to make sure we comply with the federal regulations. But there is a way to have, the federal regulations, but also to have a lot of state support, right? I mean, the state laws would not be overturned unless they directly conflict with what the federal law says. So, there are ways to, like I said, reinsert a lot of the Obama era protections through state law, because, offering protections to survivors, doesn't conflict with the, the protections, quote unquote, for the accused that have been put in place by the new federal regulations. And the federal regulations, they are law. The Obama guidance was, a suggestion to school, a very strong suggestion, but this is the law. This is serious stuff. And it really is a disservice to survivors, to schools, to really sort of mandate procedures that schools really fought against and that schools don't want. They really think that this is wrong. This is the wrong way to approach it.
Yeah, and I mean, a couple things that could be done in legislation, we were talking about last night, requiring all the universities to submit data. how many sexual assaults, what their response to those sexual assaults are, submitting their policies for the state to review, making sure that those policies are compliant, making sure that some states require climate surveys that I mentioned before. That's those, comprehensive surveys that are trying to understand what your real problem is on campus, so that you can then adequately and uniquely to your campus tailor prevention programming. So what your climate survey data shows you is, again, that discrepancy between what's being reported to the office and how many incidents students and faculty, staff are reporting occurring on campus. But if the state were to require all of the colleges to complete those climate surveys, we know that not only are they completing the climate surveys, hopefully they're going the next step to create action plans from those climate surveys to improve, the safety of their campus. And that really connects to how we think of comprehensively as a state, holding universities accountable to their students, making sure that we have the data we need to understand what the problem is on every campus, and what are the strategies to try to uniquely prevent the reoccurrence of what's happening. So a place like Rutgers is very different than Montclair State, and it's different than a small school, private school. So every campus really has to be, I think, nudged along by the state, or could be ideally nudged along by the state, to analyze their problems, report their data, and make sure that they show that they're doing what they need to do to protect their campus. So it's just some legislations require MOUs with local rape crisis centers and DV centers, so that you're integrating trained professionals responding and providing counseling resources that are tailored to the kinds of issues you're seeing. Because of course, intimate partner violence is really different than a sexual assault, and professionals are experts at responding to some of the nuances of both of those things. So like safety planning with an intimate partner violence report is really important. And sometimes our campuses don't have the personnel to do that. So you can have MOUs with campuses, local community-based resources to improve that. But those are all things that are in some model legislation that already exist in like California, Maryland, and New York's Enough is Enough law. Those can all be looked at. We also talked about there was a New Jersey task force on sexual assault that came out with several recommendations. At the time, it was under the Christie administration, but those recommendations were basically, we didn't need legislation. A lot of the rationale for that was because they thought that their recommendations were redundant with the Obama era guidance. Well, that's no longer the case. So we're in a new era, and it should be, I think, revisited with a new task force, at the least in New Jersey. I can see, where do we go from here? How do we make New Jersey a leader, in sexual violence response in our colleges?
Right. I think that's, we talk about action plans, and I think those are great suggestions. We do have a question that actually goes into the same kind of arena, but in a different perspective, so I'm going to ask it. So Judy asked that besides insisting that their college-bound students watch the hunting grounds, what would the panel recommend that parents do to protect their children? So what could be an action plan that you would advise for parents and students?
Well, speaking of statistics, what Emily said about student transcript not showing that somebody was a rapist or was a predator in some way is really frightening, because the statistic shows that most rapists are serial rapists, meaning on an average, they have 6 victims. So if we're not catching them, they're just going to keep, even if they're expelled from our school, they're going to continue victimizing. So this is really, really something we need to really remember. And that's why we need these other protections. We need people to come together. States have a responsibility, just as colleges do. So to remember that, why it's so important for parents, obviously for all the reasons we talked about. I think this is kind of a tricky question, because the activist background I'm coming from, to me, the onus should not be on a potential victim. it should be the potential rapist. And so how are we raising our boys? How are we raising our men? And I say that because 90% of perpetrators are male. So how are we contributing to the rape culture? We need to look at that. But as far as, if you want to look at individual ways to protect, most sexual assaults occur in the first 5 weeks of college because, a lot of students are getting acclimated, they want to make friends, XYZ. So those first 5 weeks are really, really important. And to, have a sit down and have a conversation with your child, or better yet, have them talk to somebody else because maybe they won't feel comfortable speaking to you about certain things. So having that support structure and really remembering those statistics.
And also having the conversation before they're about to go to college. This is a true story. So I have teenagers now, one's in college and one's in high school. And when my kids were in middle school, I was having an annual checkup. And my gynecologist, it was right after Christmas, and my gynecologist told me that Christmas is the worst period of time because she sees so many rape victims during the Christmas holidays. And these are, and this is someone who practices on 72nd Street in Central Park West. And the kids that, so the parents who were her patients bring in their daughters over Christmas break because they've been sexually assaulted at school or at parties around the holidays. And she made me promise, and she literally called me every day until I had the talk with my then, how old are they? Like 11 and 9 year olds. She said, you have to start right away. You have to tell them certain things. Don't leave your drink on the table ever. If somebody offers you punch, don't take the punch. Be aware of what you're holding. You pour your own drink. As Jerin said, the first few weeks between orientation and Thanksgiving is when most rapes and sexual assaults occur on campuses. So let your kid know about that. And insurance companies, it's so common that insurance companies call that period the red zone. There is a name for it in the insurance industry. So tell your children that they really have to protect themselves, that they should be with other kids, go to parties with a group. Everybody should look out for one another. Don't put down your drink. Just be conscious of who's around you, and make sure that you have a buddy for the evening so that, you don't, somehow get, you don't disappear. Somebody slips something in your drink, that somebody is looking out for you and notices that you're missing. So it's, things like that. And again, don't wait till, the week before your child leaves for college, because by then they're going to think they know more than you do about everything.
Right.
They really have to start when they're younger. And, I think that, Jerin raises a really interesting point, is like, how are we raising our kids? There are now efforts, and we talked about this at the symposium, and I think that this should be part of when we think about our legislation, is children have to learn about bodily integrity, respecting each other, starting in preschool. And they, have to learn age appropriate. Obviously, the curriculum has to be age appropriate, but they have to learn about, abuse, or seeing abuse, reporting abuse of, any kind, so that by the time they go to college, they're not confronted with these issues for the first time, and they're not like deer in headlight, that they really understand that this happens. They know what to do in case they need help. They know who to report to. They know that they can, if they have a, supporting family, that the family can stand in their stead. But it really has to be ingrained in everybody. Certainly, what they do if they are the victim, but also that, young children have to learn not to be predators, right? They have to, we have to erase this, as Jerin said, this rape culture, and have a culture that doesn't glorify violence against women and girls. So that really has to happen from the cradle on, so that that's, a key way to reduce sexual assault and harassment.
And I would just add quickly, just that the majority of people that are involved in sexual assaults on college campuses, they're not, it's not someone that's hiding behind a bush and a stranger. It's typically someone knows. It might be an acquaintance. They so one of the things I think that's important is this consent movement, verbalizing consent. It's very common that someone who is a victim of a sexual assault will freeze, they'll not say anything. You hear this a lot in narratives of events that are happening. And so I think that really raising the sort of ability to talk about sex with your partner, be comfortable. If you're going to have sex and this is your first sexual interaction in college, you know, you have to be comfortable talking to your kids that you're going to have sex. If you choose to do this, make sure you can communicate what you want, what feels good, what doesn't feel good. I don't want to do that. I want to do that. We have to talk about sex in a way that is communicative, where partners can talk, because I know that, you know, I don't want to minimize anything, but that is part of this larger picture, I think, when we're talking about the first sexual activity of people in college. And when someone is, you know, forcing someone to do something where they're not verbalizing their consent, that's where we start to have problems. So I think it's really talking about sex with your kids, getting comfortable with that. If you're embarrassed, they're going to be embarrassed. And then we get in this position where nobody can say what they want, you know, clear communication.
Yeah. So actually, we had another question from the audience, which was similar, which actually I think you addressed, you know, how do we change the culture of rape? And I kind of wanted to bring it together back to, you know, one of the other things that really stood out for me at that symposium at Rutgers was, you know, all the academics who presented their research there, you know, all talked about the fact that it needs to start young. It needs to start with sex ed. It needs to start young, right? Really young, like we're talking elementary school. And the other thing that I remember was what Emily just brought up, is that in their research that I think was done mostly at Columbia, and I forget where else, it was like schools in New York, that they found that there was this disconnect between, you know, the communicative part and the feeling part, right? Like we teach our kids about sex education and like sort of the semantics of it, but we don't really teach them to verbalize what it's supposed to feel like, or what is, you know, that it's supposed to actually feel good. Like, you know, and they also talked about verbal consent versus more sort of, you know, bodily consent, you know, like, and the difference between that. And sometimes, you know, sex may be wanted but it's not verbally consented, and how that's different from, you know, the extreme case of, you know, not wanted at all. But, you know, the good news is that I think we have more and more states that are starting to recognize sort of the sex education part and how that's linked. The other thing that I did want to mention was, you know, CICUS is an organization nationally that sets up, does work on sex ed standards, and I was watching one of their seminars, and they talked about the fact that just teaching your child, practicing the skill of saying no, like actually practicing it, they have found, like, I think reduces the occurrence of sexual assault by like 50%. And to me, that's amazing. I mean, that's something that, you know, any parent, any school can do. It does not take that long to do that. But the fact that, you know, once they have that skill and they're able to use it, it gives them, you know, sort of the strength to protect themselves. So I thought that was an amazing statistic. I don't actually see, so somebody did write that the New Jersey state standards for health and PE in K through 12 have been updated with lessons and standards regarding sexual consent, which again, I'm going to give a shout out to all my colleagues because we fought for that this year, starting with last year and this year. But then it says, how can parents make sure their local school districts apply these standards in their curriculum so that every student receives that education?
So we did a top to bottom study before the pandemic. I actually have a paper that a student wrote, an excellent paper on this. And we actually looked at the new curriculum is great, the new requirements, that it actually, we think, our conclusion is that it falls short of discussion of sexual harassment itself, right? It talks about sexual assault, but there's not enough emphasis on, sort of sexual harassment. So I think there's room. I mean, I think it's a great feat that this, the standards were changed. I think there's room to tweak those. And then in terms of implementation, that's a really, really great question because, as Jerin has said repeatedly, you could have the best laws on the books, and if they're not actually implemented, then, they're just writing on a piece of paper. And I think this is where parent activism comes in to say, hey, you're obligated under law to really be informed and have, the parents, sort of have, meet over this and say, this is what is required. Every school is supposed to have someone, an anti-bullying specialist on board in New Jersey, right? And it's really critical to make sure that the anti-bullying specialist also realizes that sexual harassment, sexual abuse all come under the umbrella of, bullying, and they have to be trained on how to deal with it and how to recognize it. I mean, there are cases, our research is based on actual instances where, there are people who were young, we're talking about, K through 8, who were sexually assaulted, and the administrators in the school said that that was not a form of bullying. And, took no repercussion against the person who sexually assaults, like, oh, the person was just being a boy. And this is the 21st century that we're talking about. We're not talking about the 1950s. This is today, and this is in New Jersey, and we were able to find enough examples of that to, to really realize that the people on the ground are not trained. So I think the question that was posed is excellent, and we really need to also make sure that there's funding for training like that. That, a lot of people, when I was in the cases where I defended victims of sexual abuse in school, the schools didn't even know who their Title IX coordinator was. They didn't know who their anti-bullying. The anti-bullying specialist is also the person who wears 50 other hats in the school. Usually. So it's really critical to really say, look, this is a really important person, and we have to make sure that we have the appropriate funding so this person can get the proper training and to be able to do their job. And it's not just checking the box off for the state. You really have to take this stuff seriously.
So, so again, I am actually part of we have a sex education coalition in New Jersey that is working on, we worked on the standards, on, making sure that the standards were kind of what we wanted. Initially, when they came out with the draft, they really, really fell short. And we gave testimony, and I actually went down to Trenton and gave testimony in front of the State Board of Education. And, different people came at it from different ways. And me representing now, like, this is what I focused on, is how, consent-based comprehensive sex education prevents sexual assault and teen pregnancy. Right. And, but, we all also recognize, I mean, that team recognizes that the work is not done. We're falling through with implementation. We're also constantly looking at how can we do it better? Like, how can we improve for the next time around, right? So in all of our advocacy work, I hear all of you, because I have learned in my last year and a half with working with all the advocates around the state, that just because a law is passed really does not mean anything. We have cases where we had a really good pay equity law passed last year. And when I meet women all the time, ask me, why don't we have pay equity in New Jersey? Well, we have a law, but no one knows about it. And we have the same thing with our new sick leave. Employers are not going to tell their employees that you can take sick leave. But, so it really is up. I agree with Jerin has said this before. I think Jerin has said this multiple times, that it really is up to the activists to make sure that, people are held accountable and that we can follow through. So I agree with that. So I don't see any more questions. So does anybody have anything that they want to offer as closing thoughts?
I can go. As I mentioned, I was able to spearhead this policy because I was in student government. So I can't say enough that women and LGBTQ people have to run for office. We have to run for office. we need to be the decision makers. You know, it's amazing that all of you on this panel, the activism you've done on behalf of people, but you know, Anjali, you know, when you head an organization or you really are at the decision-making table, it makes all the difference. So a huge shout out. We have to not even just be allies, but we have to be the ones making the decisions. We need to run for office. And also, you know, talking about sex with your kids may not be the easiest thing for every parent. There are a lot of cultural precedences that can hinder that. I know my parents would never feel comfortable talking about sex with me. But so then parents need to have other people that they can connect their kids to. Maybe it's an aunt, maybe it's an uncle, whoever it is. But this conversation has to happen. And I really appreciate you bringing up the consent part of it because it is so important. And you know, the pushback on that is, well, it's not sexy if you keep asking if I can do this. No, actually, it's very sexy. It's very sexy when you talk about sex and you talk about what are the things you want to do, or you know, I think that's very sexy. So we need to talk about that. And as far as saying no, I see that there's parents doing this all the time where somebody wants to pick up a child and the child doesn't want to, and the parent is like, no, it's okay, they can pick you up. No, absolutely not. If the child is like even a little squeamish, do not make them have any kind of physical contact or anything that they're not comfortable with. So yeah, so I'm really, really grateful for this panel and for all of you. And I think there's a lot of good precedents that we can follow, like the Enough is Enough law in New York. And I actually feel very positive, even with all the awful stuff that Devos did. Yeah, I'm very hopeful.
Thank you, Jerin. Yeah, I cannot agree more with everything you said. I mean, to me, it's always about electing feminists, right? And we know from our history in our country that, you know, when, you know, there's so many, it's a very common adage, right? When you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that is, it could not be more true. So absolutely, we need to be in the places where decisions are made. You know, that's what the key is, right? But before we end it, I agree with Jerin. I am hopeful. And, you know, not only do we have this great conversation today, we know that we're not going to end it here, right? I mean, this was just the start of getting this conversation going. I think we have some definite ideas on where, you know, we can take it next. You know, we know that there is much we can do in terms of advocacy, in terms of legislation, or whether it's even just reviewing that task force report that we talked about, which was done during the Christie administration. It probably is, you know, a good time to take a look at that and update that. So I think those are definite things that we can advocate for from now, from your organizations, you know, all our partners that we work with in New Jersey, and another shout out to Rutgers, one of our key partners, even on the sex ed stuff, is Answer from Rutgers, which is a, you know, youth advocacy group that works with sex education standards. So I think that's the great part, is these coalitions that work together to really bring change. And I can't thank our panelists enough. So thank you, Emily and Jerin and Penny.
Thank you.
And I really look forward to continuing this work. I know we're not ending this tonight, so we will keep fighting and we will keep bringing change. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So before we do end, I do want to give a shout out to our next panel. So we have a really interesting panel coming up on Monday. And this falls within NOW's core issue of LGBTQ rights. And we decided to talk about something that doesn't get often talked about, especially not within NOW, and that's gender fluidity. So even though NOW historically has been very pro-LGBTQ, and we actually have like lots and lots of gay members and leaders in our organization, this whole idea of gender fluidity, which we know The younger generation gets it a lot better than most of us do. We thought it would be interesting to talk about it, to explore it, especially also from like a legal point of view, because it presents a lot of challenges. We do live in a binary gender society, right? Almost every form that you fill out, you have to mark whether you're male or female. And there are so many things that go with that. So on Monday, we have an amazing panel moderated actually by Danny Newberry, who runs the Union County LGBTQ Affairs Office. And we have panelists that are from a wide variety. We have a Board of Education member from Maplewood, South Orange, Shannon Cuddle. She's an elected official who is openly non-binary. So I think that's amazing. We have somebody from the Bayard Center for Social Justice, who is a trans person who will be talking about more of the legal aspect of it. So I think that will also be very interesting. And then we have Dr. Catherine Lugg, also from Rutgers, who actually is an academic who does research on this subject. So do join us on Monday, the 21st, right? That's our next panel. And then we have a bunch of other panels that are planned for the next couple of weeks. So you can go to our website, nownj.org, and look under conference and sign up and register for those. So thank you again, everybody. Thank you to our sponsors, and good night. Have a great
Good night.